So in 1935, there's this 12-year-old kid named Walter Pitts living in Detroit. And one day he's getting chased by some kids in his neighborhood. They want to beat his ass. And he ducks out into a public library. So his home life must have been garbage because he ends up spending 3 days hiding out in this library where he, over those 3 days, reads the entire Principia Mathematica, which is a 3 volume, 2,000 plus page text on the theory that you could create all mathematics, beginning with a function that can only return true or false. So Walter writes a letter to one of the authors of those books, Bertrand Russell, and he explains to Bertrand Russell that, hey, there's some errors in your books. And Bertrand Russell writes Walter back and says, wow, you should come to Cambridge University in England and study with me as a graduate student. But Walter's 12 years old. He can't get to England. 3 years later, however, Russell is a visiting professor at the University of Chicago. So 15-year-old Walter runs away from home and goes to Chicago, where he just kind of hangs out. He's homeless, but he sneaks into a lot of Bertrand Russell's lectures. And then Bertrand Russell eventually tells him, you should go meet this guy named Rudolf Carnap. And Carnap had written a book called The Logical Syntax of Language. So Walter shows up at Carnap's office with a copy of the book, annotated and corrected, and they have a whole conversation about those annotations and corrections. And he ends up leaving, but he never tells Carnap his name. So Carnap spends the next 3 months trying to find this homeless kid. And when he finally does, he gets him a job, like a menial job at the university, like a janitor or something. So Walter works the job for the next 3 years. He's still homeless, but at the same time, he's rubbing shoulders with all these famous mathematicians and neuroscientists, and he's attending lectures on theoretical biology and all that. He's having a pretty good time. But 3 years later, in 1941, he meets Warren McCulloch. Now, Warren McCulloch is a 43-year-old professor of psychiatry, and he's super eccentric. He is known for having a diet of cigarettes, whiskey, and ice cream. He adopted 17 kids, and they say he wouldn't go to sleep before 4 a.m. So the two of them meet and they discuss a few things. The first thing is the Principia Mathematica, which is the book that our guy Walter had read and corrected in the library in Detroit in 1935. The other thing they discuss is 17th century philosopher Gottfried Leibniz. Now, Leibniz had tried to create an alphabet that was made up of symbols that represent human thoughts or concepts, and then you could put them together and manipulate them in a very mathematical way to produce all knowledge. And McCulloch had just read a paper by a British guy named Alan Turing who described a machine that could compute any function. And McCulloch's like, yep, that is definitely how the brain works. Our guy Walter is immediately thinking of all the math that would be required to describe such a thing. And McCulloch says, like, hey, we're into a lot of the same books and stuff, and you're homeless. Why don't you come live with me? So Walter goes to live with McCulloch. And at night, when McCulloch's wife and kids are sleeping, they stay up all night drinking whiskey, trying to produce this mathematical version of the brain that describes logic, memory, and thinking. And in 1943, they publish a paper called A Logical Calculus of Ideas, Imminent in Nervous Activity. Now, this is the paper. All neural network research going forward is based on this paper. Everything you and I know about AI in 2026 and large language models is derived from this paper. This paper basically defined the mechanism by which Alan Turing's machine could become real. And when John von Neumann wrote the very first paper on what we would recognize today as a computer, he wrote this paper on the EDVAC. He only cited one other paper, and that was A Logical Calculus of Ideas, Imminent in Nervous Activity. So that's not the end of the story, though. Later that year, Walter hears from Norbert Wiener, and this guy is putting together a cognitive sciences group at MIT, and he promises Walter a PhD in mathematics at MIT, despite the fact that Walter never graduated from high school. So by the fall of 1943, Walter is living in Cambridge. He has his own apartment and he's working on his thesis. And his thesis is that we all start out, humans, our brains start out with random neurons. And by altering the threshold at which a neuron switches from false to true over time, the randomness would give way to order and information would emerge. And in 1946, Walter announces his doctoral dissertation is going to be on three-dimensional neural networks. But by 1952, Walter is feeling less than productive. He kind of misses working with McCulloch. But Norbert is putting together a new team that's going to include McCulloch, who immediately quits his job in order to run off to Cambridge in order to work with Walter. So they're super happy about this. But and this is technically a mystery, but Norbert immediately cuts them all off. There is a general theory that Norbert's wife engineered this because she hated McCulloch, but I don't think anyone actually knows for sure. The one thing that we do know is that this is the first hint at Walter's decline because Norbert had become a bit of a father figure to him, and now he was cut off from Norbert with no explanation whatsoever. So in 1949, Walter is working with McCulloch and this biologist Umberto Maturana, and they are working on figuring out how the brain processes visual information. And Walter assumes that the light would go in through the eye to the brain, which would feed it a bit at a time to neurons, which would turn it into information. The problem is what they found was that the eye was analyzing information before it ever even made it to the brain. And this kind of threw a wrench in everything because it went against their original paper. The original paper and research had brought a bunch of scientific fields closer together, namely neuroscience and artificial intelligence. But now, based on these findings, there's going to be a split between these two fields. Like Walter had figured out the thing that could build Turing's machine, but he also proved that you couldn't use it to explain how the human brain works. And this is kind of like now where a lot of people in 2026 do not believe that scaling alone is going to get us to artificial general intelligence. Anyways, after that, Walter's work is more or less dismissed and forgotten by the neuroscience community. And our guy Walter gets real depressed and he's drinking all the time and he doesn't go out anymore. And when MIT offers him his PhD, he refuses to sign the paperwork and he sets fire to his dissertation, all of his notes, and his papers. Like, this is years of work that people have been waiting on, and he burns it all up. There's even stories about the university offering rewards for anyone who can find some remnants of the data. Like, people really wanted this, but he just lit it all up. And then on May 14th, 1969, Walter dies alone in a boarding house in Cambridge of internal bleeding related to cirrhosis, which was caused by his heavy drinking. And he was 45. Interestingly, 4 months later, McCulloch died and he was 70.